Good afternoon and welcome to a special edition of Public Affairs, Public Access with a very special guest, physician, author of the book Broken Promises, Broken Dreams. Our special guest is a frontline and firsthand witness to the chaos and turmoil among Israelis and Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. Drawing upon the experience of women embroiled in the conflict, our special guest will share with us unique conversation about Israel and Palestine and the urgent need for political activism. For the hour, we are honored to have with us at this table Dr. Alice Rothchild. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Doctor, please describe the process and system whereby a mother in West Bank or Gaza, what she endures to get medicine for her child, daily diabetic medicine, daily medicine for seizures, for instance, medicine for a heart condition, flu vaccinations. What does a mother endure?
Well, I think the major issue that a mother faces is one of access. So that in the West Bank, to go from a village to another village with a pharmacy or to a hospital involves going through checkpoints, getting permits. And so the big problem is, can she get the permits and get through the checkpoints to where she needs to go to get the medicine? There's also a problem of having the medicine getting to the West Bank because of all the difficulties in transporting in an area where there are so many obstructions of access. In Gaza, it's much worse because there's a blockade of all of Gaza, so that there's a severe shortage of medication, and there are people that are actually sick and dying from lack of medication.
In your book, and in the framework of our topic this afternoon, in your book you discuss some of the terms that we hear in the news and that we hear with respect to this problem, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-Palestine. And then by definition, that means that there would be a group of folks anti-Israeli, anti-Palestinian. Clarify for us how we should frame this debate.
Well, I think the framing is often pro-Israel means that you support the most right-wing policies of the Israeli government, and pro-Palestinian means you support whoever is in charge in Palestine. I think it's a much better framing to say there are people who are with the Israelis and Palestinians who are working for a peaceful solution with justice, and there are people, Israeli and Palestinian, who are not working for a peaceful solution. And that's a much more viable framework to talk about, because the lines are not actually drawn between Israelis and Palestinians, but people who are doing things that make things better and things that make things worse.
That brings me to a question. With respect to Israeli government and then Palestinian government, let's say individuals in either camp do not agree 100% with direction that their government or leaders are taking. How are they deemed? Are they deemed less patriotic? Does that concept exist over there, or are those opposing views represented, respected, and listened to?
Well, it's very hard to use the word they when it comes to either Israel or the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, Israel has something like over 20 political parties, and it's a parliamentary system, so that bigger parties have to coalition with smaller parties, usually the Orthodox religious parties, and so the religious have a disproportionate amount of importance in the political system with relationship to their numbers. So it's a complicated system to know who the they is. There's certainly a lot of active conversation in Israel. There's also a lot of fear, a lot of cynicism, a lot of despair. Many people feel very lost about what the direction is that they can go forth. And in the West Bank and Gaza, there's a huge amount of political turmoil. There's And so you see arguments between Fatah and Hamas being in control in Gaza. And so the political scene is very chaotic. And the interesting thing is that both in Israel and Palestine, the leaders are weak, and the people are usually are currently quite dissatisfied with the leadership. But as is also true in America, oftentimes the dissatisfaction of the people doesn't translate to either their voting for a better leader or getting a better leader. So it's a complicated situation, but I wouldn't use the word they because it's such a multifaceted situation.
When you mentioned that presently both Israeli government, yes indeed, Omer is seeking partners, or the coalition is perhaps going to fracture, and yes, the two main
Hamas
parties
and Fatah, right.
Are at odds with one another. Is there any other alternative, whether it be a younger generation of Israelis or a group of individuals who have studied abroad? Is there any other parties or groups that are gaining relevance
I don't
that
think
you forecast perhaps
I really don't know
making an impact?
I don't know the answer to that question. I really feel that a lot of the discord comes back to the United States because the United States has a huge amount of military funding and political cover for the actions of the Israeli government, and also for covering for the actions of the Fatah government. So I see the main actor as really us, rather than the parties there, because we facilitate and we fund a lot of the discord. So it's really complicated. And then you have the impact of all the neighboring Arab-speaking nations and their input, and so it gets pretty complicated.
What was your reaction and opinion when America's persuasion for democratic elections in Palestinian Authority resulted in Hamas
right.
winning,
Right.
and then those elections were not, were discounted,
Right.
and the results were effectively nullified?
Well, I think it's sort of stunning that the Palestinians have actually had two democratic elections since Arafat died, and they don't get any credit for actually pulling off two real democratic elections in really difficult conditions. And so there's sort of a hypocrisy for the U.S. to say you have to have a democratic election and then we don't like who you nominated. There's been a lot of fear about Hamas being elected because Hamas has a military wing. It's responsible for horrific suicide bombing. What many people don't understand is that Hamas also has a huge charitable wing. So they run schools and hospitals and have taken care of many, many, many people who otherwise would be neglected by everybody. So the analysts who've looked at this election see the election of Hamas as a vote against the corruption and inadequacies of Fatah, and not a vote to drive Israel into the sea. So Hamas was the clean government party. And so what's happened is that because the immediate reaction triggered a world boycott of Hamas and of the Palestinian Authority and of all the funding that goes to keep the Palestinian government alive, Hamas never had a chance. And so
Right.
you have to ask, what would have happened to people who are more extreme if they'd been given the opportunity and the responsibility to govern? And one of the things I always like to remind people is that a number of Israeli prime ministers before the State of Israel were, quote, terrorists, were blowing up buses, were in the Stern Gang and the Palmach, and basically were terrorist organizations, and they grew to be more mature leaders and they became prime ministers. And so one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and you really need to say that in this situation the people in Hamas never had a chance. And now the Israeli government has arrested, I think, something like 40% of the Hamas elected legislators. I mean, they're really not being given a chance to govern. And I think it would be very interesting to see what they would do if they could govern, because if they control the resistance, then they can make it less militant or more militant, and they haven't been given an opportunity. So there is a hypocrisy in the way the U.S. and Israel and all the other major powers have dealt with this. And I think Palestinians need to get some credit for having a democratic election. It's pretty astounding.
Well, that brings me to another recurring theme in your book, is the impact of walls, literally, that split up neighborhoods, divide and partition various areas in almost like the way some congressional districts are gerrymandered here. But in your book, you not only talk about the impact of the physical walls and the checkpoints that result, but also walls more spiritually, mentally, politically, and economically. Is there ever going to be a break, or is there a little leak or a potential for a break in any of those walls and barriers?
Well, there are people that are in the peace movements are crossing the lines all the time. I work with Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and they have a mobile clinic every Saturday where they take Jewish and Palestinian Israelis, and they meet Palestinians in the West Bank and some godforsaken little town that hasn't had any health care for a long time, and do a mobile clinic there. And so these healthcare providers are actually crossing the line, providing care to people who are really neglected by the system. And you see lots of instances like that. There's been every Friday a demonstration in Berlin where both Palestinians and Israelis and internationals come to demonstrate against the separation wall. And there was recently a ruling to move the wall, so this was a small victory for the wall. So there are little breaks here and there, although the majority of people in Israel are very much in favor of separation. The problem is that the separation idea is really a fantasy. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian. They have a right to live in Israel just like Jewish people do. So you can't be separated from them. And then because of the location of the separation wall, which does not go along the Green Line, which is the 1967 border between Israel and Palestine, but snakes into the West Bank to include Jewish settlements, aquifers, agricultural land. Because of that, what's happened is that there are people that are Palestinian that are caught between the Green Line and the separation wall. And these people are in the seam area. And so they can't go to Israel because they're from the West Bank, but they can't get into the West Bank because they're on the wrong side of the wall. And Ruhama Marton, who's a psychiatrist that I wrote about in my book, and who was the founder of Physicians for Human Rights Israel, talks about this buffer zone as being a human wall of people, physical people that are trapped in between. So the wall is both metaphorically and physically very troublesome, but there are groups and people that continue to go across it. And it's not just secular radical people. I mean, Rabbis for Human Rights Israel, which is a group of rabbis in Israel, actively protest the separation wall, try to stop home demolitions, and use the same religious texts that the more right-wing Jewish settlers use to claim the land for themselves. So it's all very ironic to use the same text for totally different behaviors.
Well, speaking of the walls, I think our discussion goes to the checkpoints that I know are real hot points. You hear about in the news incidents at this or that checkpoint that unfortunately result in loss of life for either Israelis or Palestinians. And I know that the individuals need to use the checkpoints, whether it be going to their job that's on one side of the wall, sometimes grocery shopping, sometimes going to a doctor or going to a different facility. It's hard to know what that's like. It would seem like if you have your papers in order, if you have your ID card, you should get a rubber stamp and go through for your 2 hours, and then you're expected to come back. What is it really like?
Well, when I was in the West Bank and in Gaza, I traveled as a Palestinian would travel. So that meant I took taxis, I waited at checkpoints, I did what any Palestinian would do trying to get from point A to point B. And the thing that's interesting is if you talk to many, many Israelis, that they say that the checkpoints, which we're talking over 500 checkpoints in an area that's the size of Delaware. So most of these are internal.
Are they split up?
They're between each village.
Okay.
I took a 60-mile ride, and there were 6 checkpoints in 60 miles. So they're pretty close together. And some of them are big terminals and very high-tech. Some of them have been privatized. Some of them are just massive piles of rock that people have to climb over. I mean, there's a huge range of checkpoints. And they're also what are called flying checkpoints, which means that at any time, anywhere, you may just encounter Israeli army vehicles, and they make a checkpoint. So what this does is that you never know if you're going to get to point A from point A to point B, and you never know how long it's going to take. So you can have all your papers in order, and you can be a perfectly reasonable citizen, and you may spend hours waiting, or you may just go through, or you may spend a half an hour waiting, or you may not get through. And what I found, seemed very arbitrary. We could never predict. I mean, we were a group of physicians. We had invitations from Palestinian Medical Relief. We were supposed to be at such a clinic on such and such a day, and that didn't count for much. So the decisions are really made by the soldiers at the checkpoint. And so there's an arbitrariness about it that feels much more like control, harassment, humiliation than real security needs. And one of the things that's very impressive is that Israelis go into the army at 18 when they're done with high school. So you have young kids that are heavily armed, making major decisions about mostly civilians. And a lot of them, they're bored, they're angry, they're bullies, they're all the things that teenagers are and young adults are, and they're asked to do really an impossible task. So I think the checkpoints, they're horrible for Palestinians, but they're also brutalizing for Israelis, and they're kids that are in a very formative time of life. So they begin to see the only Palestinians they see are, quote, the enemy. Every Palestinian is a potential terrorist. I mean, you can see how the mindset develops, and then you ask these people to go and be civilized people and work for coexistence. They've just been trained to behave in a very different way. So it sets it up for the current conflict.
Something you just said sparked a thought. Here's an analogy. Don't know if it's strong or not, but say for instance with racism and prejudice in America, I think a thought that holds true is with each generation there will be less and less, and with the next generation with more enlightenment, education, exposure to everyone in the country, racism and prejudice will hopefully dwindle away. In Israel, when gentlemen turn 18 and have, is it 2 or 3 years in service?
Women go for 2 years and men go for 3 years, and then men are in the reserves till they're 55. So then every year they do so many weeks of service. So the military presence is very integrated into civilian life.
Does that exposure, does that training, does that education from the military implant some ideas in advance? If you're joining the military, especially in Israel, it would seem like you will see action, or you will be guarding or patrolling or perhaps in a firefight, and that would naturally form some opinions. What kind of an impact does that have on young people?
Well, I think the thing that's very interesting about talking to sort of, the Israeli on the street, and again, I really hate to generalize, but most Israelis don't have anything to do with Palestinians. They're not in their daily life. They don't go to school with them. They don't live next to them. I mean, it's very separate, and it reminds me a lot of Jim Crow in the United States. I mean, when I try to understand Israel, I often look at our country as a parallel example, and we have very similar kinds of problems. So what's happened is that there's much less interaction with the separation wall. For instance, there's a town called Qalqilia, which is right on the Green Line. And this town is completely surrounded by an 8-meter high wall. So being in the town really feels like being in a prison. And the town of Qalqilia used to do a lot of commercial activity with Israelis, and so there was a lot of interaction. And so there was cross-fertilization between the two people, and a lot of people in Qalqilia spoke Hebrew, and there was a mixture, and now it's totally separated. So I think that the racism is worse now because the separation is greater, and the ability to interact in a non-military situation is less. And if you talk to Israeli soldiers, they talk a lot about how they're a moral army, that they have a lot of training in human rights. But if you look at the behavior of soldiers, like soldiers everywhere, I would like to add, I don't think being a soldier helps you to be sympathetic to, quote, the enemy. I mean, I think it builds up prejudices and reinforces behaviors that don't lead to a peaceful coexistence.
Reminder to our audience, feel free to call in with your questions to Dr. Alice Rothchild. Are there historic parallels? Can you say that there are historic parallels among Jewish and Palestinian oppression, upheaval, disposition that perhaps would ring a bit of irony, or perhaps actually form a point of understanding?
Well, one of the things I found talking to Palestinians is that they have some themes that are very familiar to me as a Jewish person. Victimized, dispossessed, hated by the world. I mean, when I listen to some Palestinians talk, I think I could just flip that and talk about Jews. So I see us as very parallel. And the problem right now is that the power dynamic is such that the Israelis have a tremendous amount of power and the Palestinians don't have a tremendous amount of power. So that even though our stories, if you stop and think about it, we find a lot of parallels and we really have a lot of common humanity together. I mean, the Palestinians are often called the Jews of the Arab world. If you talk to Palestinian kids, it's really right. You'll be in, a poverty-stricken town, and you ask a kid what he wants to be, and he always says he wants to be a doctor. And I'm like, what are these Jewish kids? I mean, there's a tremendous impact, love of family, love of education. I mean, it's very wild to see all these different parallels. So I find that gives me strength to reach out and to find our common humanity, because it's just sitting there waiting for us to find it. But it's very hard to find it, for people who are there to find it.
Growing up in an Orthodox Jewish family, conservative, excuse me. Growing up in a conservative Jewish family, entering the practice of medicine, writing the book Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, did you happen to find during the course of writing your book and investigating and researching for your book that some of your own personal beliefs changed?
I think my beliefs had changed over the 10 or 15 years that led up to writing the book. I mean, I started out in a very traditional place. I'm a child of the 60s, so I got involved in feminism and healthcare reform, and I began to be a much more political person. So by the time I actually started looking at this conflict, it had been years of sort of feeling uncomfortable, being agonized about it, and not being able to talk about it, because talking about Israel-Palestine is extremely difficult in general, and is particularly difficult in a Jewish family. People all start yelling at each other as soon as you start mentioning these words. So there's a lot of incentive never to mention it. So when I had the opportunity to start to co-found a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group, it was tremendously empowering for me to hear the other story, to share my story, to see how the narratives change when you actually are faced with people who have a whole different view of the world. So I was growing into where I ended up writing this book over 10 or 15 years. So I think nothing new happened writing the book. It was a way for me to solidify it. And on my website I have pictures of me at my bat mitzvah. And sort of, that was the girl I started at. And I start with my own diaries. When I was 14, I found my 14-year-old diary that I kept when I was in Israel. So I really know this 14-year-old girl who was just enchanted with Israel and fell in love with these gorgeous soldiers and beautiful mountains, all this stuff. So I know that voice it's very familiar to me. And then I take people on the journey of where I went from that person to the person I am today.
Special note to our audience, friendly reminder, live with us for the hour, Dr. Alice Rothchild. Please feel free to call in to weigh in with your comments, opinions, questions with respect to Israel, West Bank, Gaza, Palestine. How, Dr. Rothchild, how is the history of the modern state of Israel and West Bank and Gaza, how is it taught differently in Israeli schools as opposed to schools in the West Bank? I was thinking, is history, say, post-1947-48 and pre-1947-48, for instance, how is it taught?
Well, I didn't actually go into schools in Israel and the West Bank. I was in one school in Gaza. So my understanding is from what I've read and not from what I've seen. From what I've read, the teaching of Israeli history, much like the teaching of U.S. history, is done in such a historical way as to justify the creation of the state, the actions of the state. I mean, just like when I was in elementary school, I didn't know anything about U.S. imperialism or what we did in Central America, or all those kind of stuff. I mean, Israeli history is taught in a similar kind of way, from what I can tell. The books that are in the West Bank were primarily from Jordan, and the books in Gaza were primarily from Egypt. And then the Palestinian Authority in 1993 started rewriting the textbooks. And so there's been a lot of question, people say, well, they teach the children to hate. Well, I've read a lot of studies that really bring that to question. And I think what people object to is that they have a Palestinian national narrative, and that's very threatening. But I don't think that the books teach the children to hate. You don't need to learn to hate when you have to stand at a checkpoint and watch your grandmother being humiliated and be hungry. I mean, you don't go to school to learn those things.
We have our first call. You're on live with Dr. Rothchild.
Yes, I would like to ask when Dr. Rothschild will be able to translate the book into other languages, particularly in Spanish.
Oh.
Very good question. Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a gynecologist. I wrote a book. I'm just learning about the whole publishing business. Right now, my goal is to have the book published in Hebrew and Arabic. And if I accomplish that, then I'll try Spanish. But I'm really just beginning to explore this. But that's a very good question.
Dr. Rothschild, the concepts of psychological denial, defensiveness among all involved parties, would you say that perpetuates the status quo? It seems like in the history of Israel, there's hardly been room for anyone on any side to take a breath, reflect, look back, take advantage of any hindsight. It just seems like it's going with, again, with ne'er a plateau or free moment or...
Well, I don't think it's exactly that bad. First of all, there are many what are called the new Israeli historians like Ilan Pappé, Tom Segev, Edith Zertal, people who've really gone back and looked at all the different narratives and put them all together in one spot. And so reading those books is really a wonderful experience because you get to get the whole picture rather than the, quote, Israeli side or, quote, the Palestinian side. And one book that's really wonderful is called The Lemon Tree. And again, this book was written by Sandy Tallon, and he writes about a home that was an Arab home. The Arabs were evicted. A Jewish family moves in. They grow up there. And then the the child who becomes an adult, the Arab child who's a Palestinian child, who's now an adult, comes back to the house. And it's about the relationship of this Palestinian man to the woman who grew up in this house. It's not her fault she grew up in this house. Her family moved there, and that's where they were put. And all the ups and downs, and he weaves in the history and the personal relationship, and it's a true story. So much like my book, it's weaving in the sort of history, looking at all the different angles and getting the personal as well as the political. The other thing is that when the Oslo Accords were signed, even though there are huge problems with the Oslo Accords, there was a period of hopefulness. And so there was this time when people thought, a lot of Palestinians moved back to Ramallah and started a lot of development and companies. People really thought, oh, we're really going to get over this and move on to something else. So that the history is actually up and down. It's not just going in one direction.
Well, when does discussion, examination, criticism of the politics in Israel, when does that cross a line, in your opinion, and become anti-Semitism?
That's an excellent question, because there are people that feel that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, or even if it's not anti-Semitic, it could be used by anti-Semites. And I think that's a real misuse of the word anti-Semitism. And sometimes it's hard to tell, but for me, anti-Semitism is a situation where someone is blamed for doing something because they're Jewish. And if that's the only reason that they're being critiqued, then that's anti-Semitism. But if they're being blamed for doing something because it violates humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions or something like that, then that's an ethical, moral critique of a bad policy. So that's how I try to sort it out. But it can be hard, and I think anti-Semitism exists. It hasn't gone away. But again, it's both used and abused to silence the conversation. And it's very interesting. My publisher is Pluto Press in London, and the book is distributed by Michigan Press, and they published a book by Joel Covell called Overcoming Zionism. Now, I haven't read this book, but I'm sure it's a hot book, and I'm sure it has a lot of controversial things in it. But the University of Michigan,
the title says it all.
But the University of Michigan was attacked by a right-wing Jewish group, and they got scared. They withdrew the distribution of the book. And then they had second thoughts because of all the freedom of speech issues. So now they're distributing the book again. And this is written by an academic at Hampshire College. He's a respected, thoughtful man. You may not agree with him, but he has a right to write a book. But the University of Michigan is now rethinking its relationship with Pluto Press. Now, I would say that's an example of using criticism of Israel to muzzle discussion and to silence people who are in disagreement with Israeli policy in a way that I think is very McCarthy-esque and very dangerous. I'm a surgeon. Wounds only heal when they're open. And I think we have to have all of our wounds opened and really look at ourselves and our, quote, enemies and really, that's how the healing is going to happen. So, that's what I think on that particular topic. But it's complicated. I mean, it can be hard to tell.
Dr. Rothchild, we have another call. We lost him. Do feel free to call in with your questions, comments for Dr. Rothchild. Something your book mentions is a term, self-hating Jew, thrown at individuals who are critical of Israeli politics, and I suppose that they'd be construed as self-critical. And I've heard popular comedians of Jewish descent talk about that theme in their shtick. What is the source of that concept?
What is the source of that concept? Well, I think that for centuries, Jews lived sort of in separate cultures from the mainstream culture they were in. Although there are times in history, like when they were in Spain, when they lived very well with the Muslims. I mean, there are times when they were more integrated into society. But Jews tend to be fairly tribal and tend to, like many minority groups, circle the wagons when anything bad is happening. And so that the idea that a Jewish person, for instance, me, would publicly say something critical of Israeli policy, which I think I'm obligated to do because Israel speaks in my name as, quote, the state of the Jews. That's what the Israeli government claims to be. I feel like that's my moral obligation. For other people, I'm being a traitor to the Jewish people. And so that's, and I've been called that to my face. And, so that would be how someone would define me as a self-hating Jew. Whereas I feel like, wait a minute, Jews are known for endless discussions in the Talmud. They're known for, talking and reading and researching, and we're the people of the book, and we think a lot. This is just in my tradition to think about moral questions. And the fact that I'm thinking about moral questions about a country that's, quote, the country of the Jews is a problem for many people. But I think we've got to do it. And we often talk about, has Israeli nationalism hijacked Jewish principles? Have the Jewish settlers hijacked the Israeli experiment? There are very many ways to look at it.
Feel free to call in. Friendly reminder, live this hour with very special guest, Dr. Alice Rothchild. Please call in. Your book, Dr. Rothchild, raises concern for human rights of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. What are the rights of those individuals? Is it Geneva questions, habeas corpus? What kind of rules and laws apply to those Palestinians in Israeli jails?
I'm not a lawyer, so I know the information through Physicians for Human Rights Israel. Ruhama Marton, who's the psychiatrist who founded Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and several others did a study looking at the issue of torture in Israeli prisons. And it reminds me a lot of Abu Ghraib, where the enemy is dehumanized and then horrific things happen to them. And Physicians for Human Rights Israel actually took a case to the Supreme Court where a definition of torture was sort of made about extreme physical force versus almost killing someone, and all those sort of things were debated, much like is happening here. So I don't know legally what the rules are, but I know that there's a lot of issues that if you talk to Palestinians about their treatment in jails. And the other thing is, much like how in our country a huge percentage of black men have been imprisoned, a huge percentage of Palestinians have been imprisoned, a huge percentage of Palestinian children have been imprisoned, compared to other countries. So there's a real issue of racism and fairness here that I think is troublesome.
And I assume imprisonment would have the same effect that imprisonment in the United States carries. More difficult to find work, more difficult to continue education?
Well, for a Palestinian to be imprisoned in an Israeli jail means something different. And I would like to add the Palestinian Authority is also a violator of many human rights when it comes to prisoners. One of the other people I write about in my book is Dr. Iyad El-Sarraj, who's a psychiatrist in Gaza, an extraordinary human rights activist as well as psychiatrist. And he founded Gaza Community Mental Health Program, which is an incredible program dealing with a hugely traumatized population. And he was actually tortured by the Palestinian Authority. So, there are a lot of characters in this drama that violate international law and human rights.
Friendly reminder to the audience, this is a rare occasion to talk to an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Alice Rothchild is with us for the hour. Do call in. Dr. Rothchild, would you please dispel some of the misinformation we hear or clarify us about how the media reports on Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Seems like the media sometimes accuses itself or accuses some bureaus and agencies of leaning pro-Israeli, and then there are independent journalists out there who cover from Palestinian point of view, and they're naturally construed as being pro-Palestinian. Can that conflict, can that political situation be reported accurately and fairly?
Well, I think it can, but it's not. One of the things that always happens when I'm there and I come home is I'm just struck by the total disconnect between what I've seen there and what I'm seeing in the newspapers. And I think now in the era of the internet, where you can get online and read Haaretz, which is a major Israeli newspaper that has two excellent Jewish reporters, Amira Haas and Gideon Levy, who report from the occupied territories, and there's often very vivacious debate in Haaretz. You can get on Arabic media. You can really access a huge amount of information on the web. And then there are human rights organizations, not only Physicians for Human Rights, but B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization. There's Adallah, which is an Israeli organization that looks into violations in Palestinian civil rights. I mean, the information is there. You're not going to find it in your regular newspaper. And one of the things that's very troublesome is that there are right-wing organizations in our own country that actively sort of monitor the news. And so when a radio station or a newspaper deviates from the line, they get hit with 1,000 phone calls and threats to pull their funding, and and this happens over and over again. So it makes media sort of cautious about putting their necks out because they're going to get chopped off. So this is a problem. This is a problem. But it's the same on a lot of topics. I mean, look at our reporting from Iraq. How long did it take us to have our media actually reflecting some of what's going on? We still, if you compare the Canadian media versus the US media reporting back from Iraq, it's a totally different picture, and the Canadians are much more informed than we are. So this is a problem our media has on a number of different topics.
Considering, Doctor, that your interactions as a physician, as a healer, please share with us how, say for instance, in Palestinian areas, prenatal care, preventive medicine, how are those steps, or does that exist? It would seem like the trouble it takes for somebody, say, to get their diabetic, to get their insulin, or for someone to get their seizure medicine, or something like that should be readily available to anyone. It would seem that the concept of preventive medicine would be hard to implement.
Right. Well, in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, the responsibility for providing health care theoretically was taken over by the Palestinian Authority. And so the Ministry of Health tried to set up a healthcare system based on the World Health Organization, where you have primary care level clinics in the villages, and they do all the preventive care and the immunizations and that, the basic stuff. And then if you get more sick, you get referred further up the ladder to higher level care. That all fell apart in 2000 with the second Intifada. And so basically the whole push from the Ministry of Health was to just keep emergency services going on. And so what happened was that NGOs stepped in to fill this vacuum. So you had Palestinian Medical Relief Society, you had UNRWA, which is the UN organization that provides health care in all the refugee camps. You had NGOs from all over the world. I mean, you go to the West Bank and there are NGOs from Japan and Korea, and Sweden. I mean, it's very wild, and everybody's providing a little piece of care. But it's a very incoherent kind of system. So something like preventive care or regular prenatal care both is difficult to find and is difficult to access. Plus, because it's a disorganized hodgepodge, even though everybody's doing good things, you see crazy things. Like our pediatrician was seeing kids in a clinic, sick kids, and he wanted the kids to be weighed and measured. This is your basic pediatric thing, because you want to know, is the kid growing well? I mean, even if they're there for an ear infection, you want to know the whole picture. And it was a Palestinian Medical Relief clinic, and he was told that they don't do heights and weights. Those are done by the Palestinian Authority. So this is ridiculous, from a healthcare point of view. So you can see how that lack of having a coordinated healthcare system impacts on basic things. And now, particularly in Gaza, where there's those huge boycott, vaccination programs are disrupted, all the basic stuff is not happening. And when people talk about how many people die in the conflict, they're not talking about the people who didn't get their chemotherapy, the diabetics who went into coma. They're not looking at all the sort of second line down deaths and suffering that happen when a system falls apart.
Do you see a contradiction in progressive viewpoints that U.S. Jewish community possesses with respect to women rights, rights of women, labor, civil rights, women in politics, as opposed to extending those progressive notions to Israeli policy or Palestinian rights?
Well, it's a very interesting thought because the Jewish community has traditionally been very progressive and liberal-minded. Usually votes Democrat, has been very active if you look in the civil rights movement, the women's movement. But when it comes to Israel, things are different. And I've spent a lot of work in my book trying to explore that issue and looking at the issue of Holocaust trauma and racism and all sorts of sort of cultural traumas and cultural issues that make this so hard for the Jewish community. And so there is a disconnect, and people can be progressive on everything, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there's a good chance that they won't be progressive on that. And I think this is a reflection of hundreds of years of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and then all the other issues that go into making this a difficult conflict.
In your book, you quote some Israeli and Palestinian physicians as having the thought that when it comes down to medicine, this should not be politics, or it's not about politics. And I was thinking about that thought. Do you mean by that, or did those physicians that you interviewed mean by that medicine and caring for one another should be above politics, or that don't insert it into the political equation, don't use it as leverage?
I think first of all, according to international human rights law, according to the Geneva Conventions, the providing of health care to any population is supposed to be guaranteed. There's not supposed to be any obstruction to providing health care. So that to keep medicine out of politics could mean that we recognize that health care and obtaining health care is a basic human right, and everyone has that human right. Another way to look at it is to say that a human being deserves to have health care no matter what the political situation. The problem is that health care is intimately related to politics, and that's where we see the contradictions happen.
What kind of systems are there in place with respect to health care? I mean, insurance. What's the minimum that people are allowed or granted or
Well, Israel is way ahead of us. They have universal coverage for their citizens. The problem in Israel is that they went in 2000 when the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza were no longer allowed to come and do the labor, because they did all the sort of low-level work in Israel. And so when they were blocked from doing that, Israeli employers hired people from the third world. So you can be in Tel Aviv and see people from Mongolia and various African countries and the Philippines, and they're all doing...
Flying in for that top-notch...
No, they're doing the gardening and the laboring and the agriculture and the low-level work. And so, as often happens, once these people stay their year or whatever their contract is, they often stay longer. And these people fall through the social service system. So Physicians for Human Rights has a special migrant workers clinic, where they take care of people and then they advocate for them in the Israeli healthcare system. So the Israeli healthcare system is top-notch, first world. People come from all over the world to come to Hadassah Hospital, but there are these pockets of inequities. The other thing is that if you look at Palestinian villages, their social services aren't funded as well as Jewish villages. And if you look at, let's say, the Bedouin communities or the Palestinians living in unrecognized villages in Israel, they also don't get the same quality of care and funding as Jewish citizens do. In the West Bank and Gaza, it's sort of chaotic. There's an insurance that's provided by the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority right now is pretty bankrupt. So I really don't know, what kind of insurance is actually functioning. And there's a lot of fee-for-service and private care as well. If you live in a refugee camp, which means that your family was made a refugee either in the 1948 war or in the 1967 war, then the UN is responsible for your care. But these UN clinics and hospitals are completely overworked. There's not enough personnel. I don't know the quality of the care there, but from what I've heard, people just sort of are churned through because there's so much need and so little available for them.
I appreciate, Doctor, the description you gave us about how the checkpoints worked. Again, because that just to most
it's hard
people
to imagine, right?
Seems abstract. Something else. What is it with papers? If you're living in the Israeli occupied territory and areas, what kind of papers? Do you have to carry something the equivalent of ID card with you at all times, or is there more to it than that? Or are you screened at different times, for instance? Or questioned at different times, arbitrarily?
Well, I can tell you, I spent some time with Dr. Majed Dwiq, who's he was the dean of students at the only medical school in East Jerusalem. It's the only Palestinian medical school, and he's also a radiologist at Augusta Victoria Hospital, which is a private hospital. And he lives in Ramallah, and he works in East Jerusalem. And he has 5 different permits or forms that he has to have on him at all times. And I don't remember offhand which is which, but he has to have all 5 of them, and they all have to be renewed at different intervals. Some are 3 months, some are a year. Palestinians spend a lot of time getting their papers in order and waiting on lines to get permits done to go from place A to place B. You also have to have permits for your vehicles, so it gets even more complicated than that. And so this is how restrictions in movement happen, because so much, if there's so much effort made to get from point A to point B, after a while you're going to give up going. We went out on it with a group called Machzam Watch, which is an incredible group of Israeli women. They're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they go out to the checkpoints. They're Jewish women. They go out to the checkpoints every day, and they monitor what's going on, and they document, and they also do some advocacy if Palestinians are stuck or they see something they think is really a human rights violation beyond what they can tolerate. And the checkpoint that we were at was outside of East Jerusalem. And there was a family there. There was a man who was a nurse from Jenin and his relative who was a woman from East Jerusalem with her 20-something-year-old son. And they'd been traveling all day, and they were trying to get to the man's sister's wedding in Bethlehem, which is very, very close. It's like maybe 10 miles from Jerusalem. And just before we'd arrived, the soldiers had stopped the son. So it's a 22-year-old facing a 22-year-old, and the son had gotten angry and thrown his arms up. And the soldiers immediately jumped him and handcuffed him. And we know that this happened because we spent hours there, and the Machzam Watch ladies finally got the soldiers to admit that the kid hadn't really touched them. So when we arrived, the kid's handcuffed, sitting in this sort of shed behind all the computer terminals and the concrete walls and all the stuff. And the mother is begging and pleading to let her son go. And he's just totally angry and, sitting there grumpy. And the male relative, is furious with the son for misbehaving at the checkpoint, and he's chain smoking. And so we were there for several hours and watched the Machzam Watch ladies really negotiate with these soldiers. Some of them were taunting them, laughing at them. Some of them were, much kinder, more intelligent, more mature men who were willing to have a conversation. And basically, they got the soldiers to admit that the kid hadn't actually hit them, but the police had already been called and he was going to be carted off. And so this family then ended up going to a police station where all the charges were dropped. And they missed the wedding. So, this is one day in the life of this family. And
how long did that take?
It took all day. And so you can imagine that the next time this man from Jenin wants to go visit his sister in Bethlehem, he's going to think really long and hard, because this was a really oppressive, humiliating, enraging experience. And he's a nurse living in Jenin wanting to visit his sister in Bethlehem. So you can see, Amira Haas talks about how the checkpoints are now working smoothly because people have been tamed. People have been sort of beaten into submission. And, that's a real bad thing for a population to be developing as a coping mechanism, giving up, because, hopeless people ultimately, don't have anything to lose, and that's not a good place for people to be.
You touch upon that theme of giving up and the hopelessness and despair. Quick reminder to the audience, a couple minutes left to chime in with your opinions, comments, and questions for Dr. Alice Rothchild, Assistant Professor at Harvard Medical School today. We're talking about her experience in Israel, Palestinian authorities as a physician, and through her interviews with individuals from those regions. What are the options for an individual in Palestinian territory? What are their options when they finally just give up? Are they looking to politicians to save them? Are they looking to move elsewhere?
Well, first of all, I think something like 70% of the population is very rural. So mostly they're looking to survive. They're looking to harvest their crops and to get through the year. I mean, they're at that level of functioning. It's very hard for Palestinians to leave, although there is a brain drain, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of paperwork to get out. And that's not good for the development of the region if the intellectuals and the educated people all leave. So I can't speak for the Palestinians. I'm a Jewish woman living in America. And I know Palestinians that continue to work on democratic issues, that continue to work in politics, that are trying to get changes that are more positive. And then I know a lot of people that are very depressed and feel like this is pretty hopeless, and they're sort of being strangled and strangled and strangled, and they're not very optimistic about what's going to happen. I think there was a recent study that 70% of Palestinians did not think there would ever be a peace, which is a huge number of people that feel hopeless. And that's the tragedy, because the solutions are there. I mean, there's several options. Everybody knows what they are. And it's not some mystery, but somehow getting from here to there is a huge obstacle.
One more reminder to the audience. Feel free to call in, weigh in with your comments, questions for Dr. Alice Rothchild. We were talking about her book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams. And in your book, you interview extensively 3 individuals, 3 women. Have you kept up? Do you have an update on them? With the individuals that you interviewed for your book, have you kept in touch with them?
Yeah, I do keep in touch with the people in the book that will answer my emails.
Right.
So, for instance, the psychiatrist I keep in touch with, I actually speak with her on the phone, and I'm going to be visiting in a couple of weeks, and I will see her. I've also been in touch with the woman who's a peace activist who made Aliyah to Israel, made the spiritual migration to Israel as an Orthodox Jew from New Jersey, and ultimately through the course of her life became much more aware of the political issues, and now she's the head of the Women's Coalition for Peace. So I hope to see her as well. And then there are a number of Palestinians that I've developed email relationships with, and there's a medical student who's in the book who actually is now doing her master's in international health at Brandeis University in near my town of Boston. So I see her regularly, and I'm sort of her, Boston mother. Yeah. So the relationships are all developing and evolving, but sometimes it's hard because people either don't have electricity or they have so many more pressing problems than answering emails from some lady in America.
Pardon my ignorance here. We're in the midst of Rosh Hashanah.
We're done with Rosh Hashanah. We're in the midst of Sukkot.
Thank you. How are holidays celebrated, say, in the Palestinian territories? I know there are Israelis behind those walls. Right. How does that culture work?
I mean, the thing that most people don't realize is that most Israelis are very secular. So they're Jews, but they're secular Jews. And about 20% of the population is a more religious Orthodox type of Jewish. And this is true in the settlements as well, so that the holidays are celebrated by the Orthodox in the most religious way that Orthodox people celebrate holidays, and the rest of the people are fairly secular. So they either do or don't do much of a holiday, just like secular people everywhere. But in Israel, since it's things shut down on the Sabbath, I mean, since the rules are based on Jewish religious rules, there are some things that just happen automatically because of it being a Jewish country, as opposed to a Christian country where things shut down on Sunday, that kind of thing.
Okay, so would that mean those checkpoints are closed down?
No. The checkpoints are military. The military is 24/7. The thing that happens with checkpoints is that sometimes they're manned and sometimes they're not manned. So you never know when they're going to be active and when they're going to be inactive. And they're mostly active, but it comes and goes. So, for instance, if you're taking a taxi, the taxi drivers are all on their cell phones, and they're all communicating with each other about where their guards are functioning and where the checkpoints aren't being manned at this moment, and what's the best way to get from point A to point B. And so you may end up traveling miles in a different direction to avoid something that's happening at a checkpoint to find another place that's quieter. So those go on all the time.
From your experience as a physician, from your personal interactions with the individuals in your book, what's your greatest worry or concern medically, from a medical vantage point, for individuals in Palestinian territories?
Well, you know, there's a huge amount of trauma. And if you look at the children who have, you know, witnessed horrendous things, who have seen their fathers beaten, you know, all the kinds of stuff that you hear about if you actually pay attention, what you have is a very traumatized group of children. And they're going to grow up to be the future adults that have to make the solutions to this problem. And you know, the psychiatrist from Gaza documents this very well, that traumatized children have not only emotional difficulties, they have cognitive difficulties, they're more risk-taking. You know, there's a whole host of things that are not good things for kids that happen to kids who are living in states of chronic trauma. So the thing I really worry about is the children and the impact of the situation on their futures. And if you're, you know, a young man growing up in Gaza and you don't have a future, you know, who knows what you're going to do, and who knows how you're going to be able to figure this out. I mean, there are an enormous number of peaceful civilians living their lives, but it makes it harder and harder to function when you're living in such a hopeless place. The other thing that's happened is that, particularly because of the checkpoints, there's been a breakdown in the family authority. So the father, who's supposedly the person who protects the family and has some authority, the child sees the father doesn't have any authority when faced with, you know, a 25-year-old Israeli soldier with a big gun. So the father has lost his authority. And so there's been issues around the family structure. So again, it's a whole generation of people that are being traumatized by this situation. So that's what I would worry about.
And I guess you also must fear or worry about, we haven't seen those effects yet. We haven't seen the effects of this sort of chronic, perpetual trauma.
We've seen what a lot of people say is that in the 1987 Intifada, when the Palestinians first, you know, tried to shake off the Israeli authority, that those people that were traumatized grew up to be the people who were the resistance fighters in the second Intifada. So we actually have seen some of that happening.
Final question for the hour. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Rothchild. What do you forecast for the next year politically in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza?
I don't think things are going to change very much. And the reason is that I think the main driver behind a lot of what happens there is what happens here, because the U.S. Provides so much economic and military and political funding and cover for the Israeli occupation. And so I think things aren't going to change there until things change here. And also, you know, since we're now an occupier in Iraq, we're really lost our credibility as an honest broker, and we're in the same muddle as an occupying nation. So I don't think things are going to change very much.
Thank you very much for your wisdom.
Thank you.
Sharing all of your information from your interviews, from your time spent in the Middle East, from your book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams. Pleasure talking with you. Thank you for the honor and privilege.
Thank you.
Our guest, Dr. Alice Rothchild, her book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams. This is Public Affairs, Public Access, and we return to Thursday nights at 6:30 p.m. Have a nice afternoon.